Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye is at the Brown County Library interviewing candidates in 2014 elections. We're interviewing Mr. Eric Wimberger of Green Bay. He's a Republican candidate in Assembly District 90. Eric, welcome to Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks. And
a programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. First-time candidate, Eric?
I am.
Give us the short version of the bio and any particular issues that brought you into the race, sir.
Well, I'm from Green Bay, the Green Bay area. Grew up here, went to high school here. Went to college and then drove a semi for Schneider for a while. Then went to law school, and then after law school became a judge advocate in the Marine Corps. And after all that was done, I came back here and started my own law practice on the corner, and have been working that ever since.
Okay. Any particular issues that brought you into the race, sir?
Well, I noticed that there weren't any candidates running for the Republican ticket, and I felt the need to step up at that point to do that. I guess I disagree with my opponent Genrich's general philosophy on things, so that was kind of the catalyst to it all.
Okay. Your website, you say this: big government ultimately destroys a community. Can you put that in context?
Sure. The bigger government gets, the more it's going to take from you. Now, when government gets bigger, that means it's increasing regulations, making more laws. So in that regard, it's going to take away your freedom. On the flip side of that, government needs to operate, and it's going to take taxes. So it's going to take your money. So the bigger it gets, the more it's going to take your freedom or your money, depending on your situation and your tax bracket, I guess. But then we sit there and think about who's getting more benefit, who's paying who off. Is there disproportionate payout to one person or another? And then we start to look at our neighbors and wondering if they're getting more than me. And in that sense, it destroys a sense of community. And that's what I mean by that. That big government ultimately destroys that sense of community.
You think that's true at both the state and federal levels, sir?
I do.
You do? Okay. One of the biggest issues, if you're elected, will be funding of public schools next year. What will be your priorities if you're a member of the ledge next year in terms of public funding? Funding our public schools, excuse me, I didn't ask the question very well.
Well, public school funding is very important because it sets people on a path, hopefully equally, to compete with each other for wages and things like that. And it's important to make people have the same starting point in life. So we have to have an adequate funding, but at the same time, it is a bureaucracy. There's always going to be instances of too much spending on something that doesn't need to be spent on, or waste, or things like that.
Mm-hmm. One of the biggest issues will be whether to expand the school voucher or choice program. Do you have a position on that, sir?
I do like vouchers, and the reason I like vouchers is because it's going to give people choice. If you're stuck in a school that you don't like because of where you live, there's no way for you to pick up and move because of your finances. The voucher system allows people to have the opportunity to go to a school that they would otherwise not be able to go to just because of logistics and where they live. So I think the voucher program is good for that, to give people the opportunity to put their kids in a better school. I think that it's going to be pretty self-regulating. I understand the opposition to vouchers that Democrat Party has, and I get it. But at the same time, if the schools that are receiving vouchers aren't doing a good job, then it's going to all end up playing out, because the people who do well with the voucher program, the schools that do well on the voucher program, will ultimately attract those people, and the bad schools will get weeded out.
The Assembly Speaker has said, staying on the issue of vouchers, he'd like to remove the 1,000 student cap on out-state voucher slots in the next budget. Do you think lifting the cap is a good idea?
I don't think I have a position on that right now.
Okay. 2 months ago, Governor Walker called on both the Senate and the Assembly to withdraw Wisconsin from the Common Core standards. Do you have a position on that?
Well, I understand Common Core is something that was organized by the Department of Education, and that's kind of the sticking point for me. Common Core, the concept of having a standard that schools should be held to in order to make sure that our students are learning something in particular, I think is a good idea in its concept, because you have high school and grades and then ACT and SAT, and if kids aren't prepared to achieve at those standardized tests, then they're not going to make it to the next level very well. So the idea of standardization, or understanding what is expected for standardized testing, for instance, or for what's required in a job market, I think is an important concept. But at the same time, I think the Common Core has come to a situation where the federal government is starting to make more dictates, withholding funding being a potential prospect, or making regulations that are kind of pinch localities into adopting one thing or another, instead of just being a general voluntary standardized format. So the concept of having standardization throughout the state, I think, is a good one, but how it's done, I think Common Core is becoming a negative for that goal.
Transportation funding. The Wisconsin Taxpayer Alliance says if we fund transportation at 2013 levels for the next 10 years, we'll have a deficit of $2 billion. If you think that we will have a deficit, how do you think we might make that up, sir?
I think all bureaucracy should have a baseline budget of zero. If they're $2 billion short compared to last year, I don't think that means anything whatsoever. It's what projects do we need to fund. If it's more or less, whatever it comes to, what's falling apart, what's not falling apart. I think each year is different, and just because one year is different than the last, I think is irrelevant.
Would you consider raising either the gas tax that hasn't been increased since 2006 or the $75 license plate fee that you and I pay? I think
raising taxes should be the last choice. Cutting fat on a bureaucracy should be the first choice. But in the end, government functions on taxes, so that always has to be something available and something that's necessary for government to function. However, it needs to be as minimum as possible. I think it's all very situational, depending on what the needs of the state are. If our entire infrastructure is falling apart, then we just have to look at what we can do. First, trimming the bureaucracy, and only after that consider what the tax options are.
Okay. Healthcare funding. Was it wise of the state of Wisconsin to tell the federal government, we don't want you to pay to expand the Medicaid program?
I think that came with a lot of strings.
Okay. Staying on the issue of Medicaid, the American Hospital Association has said our reimbursement rates are the second lowest in the nation. If you've studied the issue, do you have a position whether they should be raised?
I did take a short look at that. The Medicaid reimbursement appears to be just a total cost divided by number of patients. I don't think that what the reimbursement rate is compared to other states is a relevant factor. It's all about what is needed, or based on the costs in our area. So just because it might be the lowest or highest somewhere, I don't think matters. It's what is an appropriate reimbursement to the hospitals and entities that take that income and need it to cover their costs.
Okay. Tax collections fell $280 million short in the last fiscal year. If that translated into a deficit going in the next 2-year spending cycle, how do you think that deficit should be made up?
Well, my understanding of Governor Walker's plan was to account for economic growth to cover any sort of deficits, and those are on paper at this point. It's what the government would say they would need if they kept their same amount of budgeting based on what the same amount of economic standing in Wisconsin is. But it's also projected that there's going to be an increase in economic development and therefore revenue that's going to account for any sort of loss that's currently on paper. Of course, if that doesn't pan out, then you have to consider your options. And again, my first option is to trim bureaucracy rather than raise taxes.
There will be a bill introduced next session to legalize the medical use of marijuana. Colorado and the state of Washington have legalized the recreational use. Your position on those issues?
Marijuana, I think, is a changing attitude in Wisconsin, and I understand that, and I do a lot of, in my legal practice, I come across cases involving marijuana possession and use. I can't say that there's any more detriment to society on the use of marijuana than the use of alcohol, just in my own personal experience, not citing any sort of studies or anything. And just understanding my caseload and what I've done in my law practice. However, the problem with drugs, including alcohol, is that people do drugs for long periods of time, and then when their life falls apart, then they want to demand any sort of social program to get them out of that bind. So I don't think the issue is necessarily people having the freedom to use marijuana. It's the fact that when their life falls apart, they come requesting money from the government and therefore their neighbors to bail them out. So I think that if there was some sort of tie between marijuana and a social safety net, that marijuana use shouldn't be allowed if you're receiving any sort of public assistance, I think I'd be more open to it.
Okay. You mentioned the use of alcohol. Your position on first offense drunken driving, should it be a crime?
No.
Okay. Environmental question.
Let me clarify that.
Go ahead, sir.
It's currently a crime if you cause bodily injury to someone and you're drunk driving. It's also potentially a crime if you cause damage to property. However, I do have cases where someone is getting an operating while intoxicated because they're asleep behind their wheel trying to sleep it off, and they have their car running. And I just don't think that's something we should criminalize in that circumstance. There are circumstances where drunk driving is something that is reckless and can endanger others, but just to say a blanket OWI criminalization, I don't think is something that we should do.
The bill passed last session that changed mining laws to let Gogebic, Taconite potentially apply for a permit for Ashland and Iron counties. Is that a bill you would have voted for? Do you know enough about it?
I think that if the DNR gives the okay that the Taconite mine is not going to affect groundwater in a negative way, and that any sort of mining activity can be rehabilitated into reverse, like in short, fill the hole back up, and which they've done in other open pit mines. I think that it's very important. It's a big mining operation. It's going to be very important to the communities in northern Wisconsin, and also the companies in the Green Bay area that might provide services and equipment. I know my family has a small business in Lakewood, and getting jobs up there, having a living up there is difficult for those people, since obviously logging and mining kind of went away over the last half century or century. So I think the mining is a good idea if it can be done safely. I don't think mining itself is bad, but I think it can be done in a way that's going to preserve the environment, or any damage done to the environment can be reversed.
Okay. Finally, you mentioned your opponent earlier. Any other differences between you and he you want to highlight, sir?
Well, I noticed that Eric Genrich is, of course, the sponsor of the minimum wage bill, and I have a difference of opinion on that. And I know that as someone with a family business, that when you raise the minimum wage, these small businesses are not fat cats living a high life. It's a very small margin of profit for small businesses, and to simply raise the minimum wage is only going to translate in a raise in the cost of goods. So ultimately, a minimum wage increase is going to cause inflation, and that hurts people on fixed incomes, it hurts people who have saved their entire lives, and it's going to have a net zero effect on minimum wage, because everything's going to cost more. And that's why the minimum wage is never ever enough, because inflation reflects that, and everything costs a percentage or a few percentages more. So I think the best way to improve people's status in life is to make sure that there's enough resources available for people to succeed in their education through high school, and to make higher education attainable and job training available. And then people who have ambition to get beyond the minimum wage, which is 2 or 3% or 5% of the population, can do it and get out of that sort of wage situation with their own ambition and their own effort.
Thank you. Eric Wimberger is a Republican candidate in Assembly District 90. Eric, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.